Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
An epic podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 136, Wyler, Not Wilder.
Yeah, we got the names right. I'm really excited. I don't know if we'll get it right through the whole podcast.
I know, I'm kind of waiting to count the number of times that we say Wilder after doing last month's episode.
Yes, yeah. We're talking about another immigrant from Europe who was Jewish and fled the Nazis and became a very famous and prolific director in America, and happens to have a similar name and work in a similar time frame to someone who fits all of those same categories, and also have been friends with that guy. We're talking about William Wyler instead of Billy Wilder, who we talked about last time on the show. And before we
I refreshed myself in the AFI's Convo book. In Billy Wilder's chapter, he talks about going to an event where everyone applauds him and honors him for the work that he's doing in film with the war and stuff like that. And then they play Mrs. Miniver's, and that is a William Wyler film, not a Billy Wilder film.
Oh man, yeah, Mrs. Miniver does come up in this bio. So let's talk about the man before we talk about his movies. So William Wyler was born in 1901 in Alsace-Lorraine, and if you don't know too much about world history, you might not know that name, but it is a highly contested piece of land in Europe, or at least was during the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, between France and Germany. It changed hands a bunch of times, and essentially when he was born there, it was part of Germany, and now it is part of France. So it's a little confusing, even though a lot of the people there speak German. So it's a whole thing. But he holds both German, U.S. eventually, and Swiss citizenship because his father was a Swiss citizen. But all that to say that he kind of came from this era and part of this very cosmopolitan continental Europe, the kind that we see hyped up in versions of old Lubitsch movies like The Grand Hotel, where everybody is from everywhere and everyone can communicate, even though they have different cultures and languages.
Even in Nochka.
But his mother was actually a cousin of Universal founder Carl Laemmle, which is a big part of his story. So he was connected from birth to Hollywood, which makes it quite interesting. He has a reputation of being a troublemaker, and he had it from the time he was a kid. He was known as a troublemaker and slacker in school, and spent most of his time instead going to the theater or early film cinemas and staging plays at home, which this is all a recipe for becoming a film director, apparently. I've seen versions of this so many times now.
Staging plays at home is the old-fashioned version of taking your parents' Handycam camcorder and shooting movies in the woods.
Yeah, nowadays you'd have a YouTube or TikTok channel, which it's just weird. It's interesting how it changes, but it's always a thing. But anyway, he was set to inherit and take on the family haberdashery, which, if you don't know what that is, it is a men's clothing store, typically one that sells hats, but they can sell other things like shirts, suits, ties, and other textile goods.
Accoutrement.
But as he was apprenticing, he spent a year in Paris working at a clothing store and just had a terrible time of it. He hated the work. He was barely paid anything. He couldn't afford rent and slept and basically just hung out in the street most of the time. He hated every second of it, and by the time he came back, his mother knew that he was never going to go into haberdashing. So that hat ship sailed. She called Cousin Laemmle in America for help, and sure enough, William Wyler, I almost said Billy Wilder, was hired as a Universal Studios messenger for the New York office. So he even enjoyed first class passage to NYC until he realized that first class passage was actually coming out of his first few months' paycheck. And he also had a rough time of it in New York. He worked as a Universal messenger, but again, he kind of spent some time being a troublemaker and losing jobs and getting jobs. And he spent a year in the New York Army National Guard as a profession and lifestyle for a while. But eventually, he would go move to Hollywood to become a director. And by the way, he's all very young while this is happening. He came to New York as like a teenager, and by the time he goes to Hollywood, he's like 23. He started off as a member of a swing gang, which, if you don't know what that is, which is fair because it's not really a thing anymore.
Not the same as a taxi dancer like we talked about last month.
Yeah, we've getting all these weird like early 20th century's vocab in here. Anyway, he was part of a swing gang. They were a crew who would change sets very fast on silent film studio lots. So silent film studio lots are very different than the sound studios that we have today because you don't need to set up for sound recording. So everything's pretty much squished together. It's very loud. It's very hectic. There's people running all over the place because you don't have to worry about sound. All you have to make sure is that no one's in frame besides the actors when the camera's rolling. So they would be running around and switching out gear or running to fetch things for people on sets as often as they could. Think an early version of like a grip PA combo, but even faster paced and more different than you could imagine. But he was still a troublemaker, goofed off, got fired, but eventually during this period from 1923 to 1925, he would he kind of doubled down on the idea of becoming a director and basically got his crap together and got an assistant directing gig, showed up to work on time, and eventually became the youngest the youngest director on the studio lot in 1925 at the age of I think 24. He was directing westerns, silent westerns mostly at the time, and eventually this is the start of his director's career. So by 1929, he was directing talkie films, starting with Hell's Heroes, which was the first on-location sound picture shot by Universal. It was a Western set in like Arizona or something like that. I don't think Monument Valley, but think kind of like Monument Valley. Anyway, by this time, he had also become a naturalized citizen of the U.S. He kept shooting lots and lots of films in the 30s, which is super important when we talk about these kind of working directors of the early stages of classical Hollywood, how they got so good. Well, they just did it a whole bunch, really. Yeah. They had an interest and they just did it a whole bunch. So when we talk about him doing all these kind of like line pictures and assignment pictures that don't stick out in his catalog now, but when he's experimenting with different genres and working with different actors and different crews and learning about all this stuff, that's when he starts to develop his skill as a director and develop his style as a director. And speaking of style, he actually developed a partnership during this time period with famous cinematographer Greg Toland of Citizen Kane fame. Mm-hmm. And together, they kind of, not really fully invented, but further refined and popularized the deep focus style, which is always talked about when we talk about Citizen Kane, where you have a scene that is very deep, it's all in focus, and there's different layers of action, some close to the camera, some farther away, and you can kind of see it all. And it's all choreographed together by the director to kind of make some kind of logical sense and develop deeper meaning from a single shot, which is
some really famous instances of that we're going to talk about in these movies today.
Oh, for sure. The bar and the best years of our life.
Ben-Hur.
All of Ben-Hur. Even just his habit of just letting... We'll talk about all that when we get into the detail. But anyway, another thing to note about Wyler is that he had all sorts of friendships in the industry. There are very few people in the industry who talk badly about William Wyler. There's a few, but there's very few. And a lot of them who talk very highly of him.
When we get into his directing style.
His later directing style kind of gets full Kubrick, but it takes him a while to get there. So during the earlier parts of his career, he worked with people like Bette Davis and Laurence Olivier, and they both actually credit him with, in Olivier's case, teaching him how to act for the camera, and in Davis's case, directing some of the best performances and most Oscar-winning performances of her career. And he had a reputation, actually, for getting very famous actors to do these great performances and getting them Oscar nominations and often Oscar wins. And let me tell you, if you want to succeed in Hollywood, having that reputation is a good one to have.
Yeah.
It will attract all of the actors to you. But he also had really good friendships with other directors like John Huston and obviously Billy Wilder. In Huston's case, he met Huston while he was directing Huston's father, who was an actor, and we've talked about before, on the movie House Divided in 1931. And he helped John Huston out multiple times when John Huston was kind of going through his years in the wilderness, for lack of a better term, and kind of being poor and wandering around from city to city and not really having a full idea of what he wanted to be or where he wanted to work. Anyway, he started making pictures more stylized and more signature of the William Wyler style and him as a director, closer to 1931 when he worked on Mrs. Miniver, which came out before Pearl Harbor, which is important to note. And it was kind of meant to make America less isolationist, and earlier versions of the film were actually more extreme in their anti-Axis, anti-Nazi propaganda. But interesting fact, and I think we've talked about this before with Charlie Chaplin, the mood in America pre-Pearl Harbor was very interesting because essentially a lot of people just didn't want war. And it was seen as a bad thing to be too anti-Nazi, because that could lead to war. So there were a lot of things in place. For instance, the Hayes Office, the censorship board of Hollywood at the time, could ban a film for being too anti-Nazi, which is just wild to think about now.
Did not age well.
It doesn't really age well at all, does it? But yeah. So that was a thing, and it kind of curbed the more extremist points in Mrs. Miniver, but Mrs. Miniver still comes across as a very rallying movie to this day. Mm-hmm. But anyway, after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted. William Wyler signed up with the United States Air Force and agreed to make movies for them, among them two very famous documentaries, The Memphis Belle, which will be talked about in the bonus podcast, and Thunderbolt, which features, although I don't think stars, Jimmy Stewart. After the war, he would go on to make just lots of critically acclaimed films and increasingly a larger and larger number of epics, movies that were like over 2.5 hours in length. And we're talking about two of them today, actually, The Best Years of Our Lives, which is over 3 hours, and Ben-Hur, which is way over 3 hours. Which are both very big movies and will be very fun to talk about. And eventually in the 60s, he continued to branch out. This is kind of the last decade where he really worked a lot. I think he had one movie in the 70s. He branched out into newer and newer genres and kept inventing new ways to direct with newer genres that he hadn't experimented with before, like musicals or serial killers, one of which we'll talk about today. And he even directed Barbra Streisand in her first film role in Funny Girl. And he actually did a lot of the same stuff that he did for Olivier, where he kind of essentially taught Streisand how to work on camera versus on stage.
Yeah.
And they actually got along famously well, which is shocking because Streisand does not have a reputation for getting along with a lot of people famously well. But it seems to be, after looking at some of Wyler's comments, that she essentially recognized Wyler's talent and Wyler recognized her talent, and they started to get along way better, which is funny because I watched Funny Girl the other day, and it's not too dissimilar from the relationship and colleague, essentially the professional relationship between Barbra Streisand's character in that movie and Ziegfeld in that movie, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah.
But anyway, that pretty much catches us up on the background of William Wyler. I'm going to stop rambling now. Jonathan, what movies are we actually talking about today specifically?
All right, we're kicking off. We're kind of highlighting his post-war years because that's when most of his big hits. He did have some really famous films from before, but we're focusing on the post-war films, starting with The Best Years of Our Lives from 1946, based on 1946 novella of the same name. I think production on the film started less than a year after the war ended. Starring Frederick March, Myrna Loy, Dana Andrews, and a few others. It's definitely an ensemble-type film. Notable for the first non-actor Harold Russell to win an Oscar. We're going to talk about him a lot. He's also the only person to win 2 Oscars for the same role, which is really interesting because basically I think what happened based on the way that it's described on Wikipedia is that the Academy gave him an honorary Oscar because they thought he was a long shot, but since being in the film in the way that he is, which again we're going to talk about, they thought that he deserved it, and then he ended up winning the votes too. So he had the honorary Oscar and the official Best Supporting Actor for the same role.
That's such an Oscar thing to happen.
I know, right? And this film is one of the first 25 films to be included in the National Film Registry in the Library of Congress, which we don't talk about too much, but I think it's kind of a status symbol for certain films, and a lot of these fit that, so that's why I wanted to include it. We'll be following that up with Roman Holiday from 1953, starring the best Hepburn, Audrey Hepburn, and Gregory Peck.
Wow, we're doing that?
I just gotta slip that in
geez.
every time.
Dang. Wow, freaking
actually
shooting shots already.
And this is actually her breakout role. And this film, actually, on casting, turned down by Cary Grant because he thought he was too old to play the romantic lead opposite Audrey Hepburn, even though it's kind of a semi-romance thing. But see our episode on Charade, episode 63, for more about that story.
Yeah,
and they
that's
actually
really funny.
did
That's
act
not
together.
that's not the only time he turned down working with Audrey Hepburn in a role as well. I think we literally talked about last week. He turned down the role in Sabrina because of the same reason.
Audrey Hepburn, yeah. And the film was written by Dalton Trumbo, who was on the blacklist at the time. And there were some other writers on there, but he wasn't actually credited. So that's a whole other aspect of the political drama that goes on with Hollywood. This film is also in the National Film Registry. And then we're going to be talking about one of the most epic films of all time, Ben-Hur from 1959, based on the novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ from 1880. It's a remake of the 1925 film, which I believe William Wyler was also involved in. He
was an assistant director.
Position. Yeah.
One of 30 assistant directors, by the way.
There's a lot of assistant directors and supporting directors in this film, too, because there had to be. The film stars Charlton Heston and Jack Hawkins, and this film is also in the National Film Registry. And finally, we're going to be talking about The Collector from 1965, which is a giant change of pace. Based on
very different.
Based on the novel The Collector by John Cohn, starring Terrence Stamp and Samantha Edgar.
All right, Jason, without further ado, let's jump right into the best years of our lives from 1946. Take it away.
The best years of our lives from 1946. After World War II ends, 3 veterans in the Midwestern town of Boone City are left to pick back up where their lives left off pre-war. Sergeant Al Stevenson goes back to being a banker, but with a different outlook on money and a family that spent a lot of years growing without him. Bombardier Fred Derry had a whirlwind wedding to a slick dame before he left, and finds himself returning to a whirlwind marriage and a job that views his service as a disservice to his career. Finally, Petty Officer Homer Parrish, barely out of high school before the war, finds himself back home with prosthetic hooks in place of hands. His family and fiancée try hard to show him love, but Homer has to figure out how to first live with himself.
All right, Alex, this film is what I kind of took away from it is that it's like a mosaic of showing intimate relationships in a I mean, the term is very common now, but in a post-traumatic world, like the entire world was basically post-traumatic. And this is one of the first films that actually displays PTSD. It wasn't even a thing. They were still figuring it out. You can go back to, there's the John Ford film, Let There Be Light, about the psychiatric institutions for veterans after World War II. But this film really takes 3 different perspectives on how you come back from a traumatic event, and you either have to re-engage in your intimate relationships, form new intimate relationships, or what happens when your former intimate relationships start to crumble around you. And it's so sensitive around all of those things, and it pulls it off really well. but it's kind of fascinating and heartbreaking to watch, which is the point. Like there's no way to do this in like a joyful way, I guess.
No. It's super well done, and William Wyler's a really good person to direct this, obviously.
Oh yeah.
Because he came back from the war too, and he even suffered. I couldn't find details, probably because I didn't dig too deep. But he did suffer an injury that impacted his hearing during the war. It was
from being in the Memphis Belt. The engines in those planes would make a lot of the pilots and crew go deaf.
Oh wow!
So that's what I think. He regained some hearing in one ear, but was totally deaf in the other ear.
Yeah, he's straight up in the plane while they're being shot at and doing a bombing run. Like that's how they made that documentary. So he's. I mean, I don't think there's any mistake in the him making one of the characters a bombardier.
The main one, yeah, and he has this whole sequence of sitting in one of the planes being scrapped and having a nervous breakdown, basically. And that I think that wasn't in the script. I want to say that in the AFI chapter, he says that they basically were there filming that bit, and he was just like, let's have him just have this full on breakdown, because he knows the mind space of these characters that he's portraying.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good deep dive into trauma and like how that's carried. And even into like the idea of like getting even deeper, like how the idea of the anticipation of trauma can lead to rushed decisions. For instance, like our bombardier's marriage,
right?
Which was clearly rushed before the fact of before he left for war. And how you have to wrangle with that after the fact once life's returned to pace, how other people who didn't suffer the trauma in the same way can't really understand. At its most fundamental level, it's a really, really good drama. It may be one of the best examples of like that kind of storytelling and drama as a genre in and of itself, which we don't see super often anymore. But just to see it. But the
drama
other thing
as
really,
like a characteristic of a film.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, and there's lots of smiling and laughter in here too, right? But it's about these people dealing with something that is hard, and also they had no control over, which immediately makes them also super sympathetic, and also, you know, they don't. Maybe one of the things that helps it so much is that they're not really whiny. They're just dealing with it, right? Like the nickname for that generation is the silent generation, because they came back from war and just didn't talk about it, and you can see that here. And maybe it's because it was too much trauma to speak of, and maybe it was because nobody back home would understand. Like when Frederick March's character is trying to show these objects that he picked up in the war to his son, and his son's like, atomic power isn't good, and he's like, yeah, okay, but I wasn't talking about that.
Yeah, the armchair intellectualizing of the war being met by the people who lived it.
Yeah, the lived experience versus the theoretical experience clashing. But maybe one of the best things about this is not just that it is such a good example of a drama, but that it is such a perfect drama for 1946, right?
Yeah.
Like it is the perfect drama for that year. Yeah. And it basically, it also is known as the movie that kind of filled the same slot as, and essentially beat out in the box office and in Academy races, It's a Wonderful Life, which came out in the same year. And kind of came out around the same time. They were both basically holiday movies, and lost out big to the best years of our lives. And a lot of times, It's a Wonderful Life is really popular, mostly because of its syndication through the 60s, 70s, and 80s on TV. So it became a classic holiday film that way. And a lot of people know that one a lot better. And sometimes when you hear about It's a Wonderful Life, you start doing research on it, you hear about the best years of our lives this way, and you're like, oh man, it's like How Green Was Our Valley. It beat out the better movie. I don't like it. And then you go watch it, like you go watch How Green Was Our Valley, and you're like, oh, this is actually a really good movie. Yeah. Because it is. And one of the best like facts that could demonstrate that is the fact that it's over 3 hours long. It feels like it's an hour long, and at the end of it,
Yeah,
you're
it
like,
really
but
does.
I want more.
Yeah.
I would like to see the rest of the best years of their lives.
So yeah, and I was thinking about that dichotomy because you'd brought it up before we started prep for the episode, and I hadn't seen this one before. So I was thinking about that dichotomy between It's Wonderful Life and The Best Years of Our Lives, and it's interesting because they do take place in the same period. It's Wonderful Life is almost like the mirror reflection of this. It's the civilian life because Jimmy Stewart's character isn't able to go to the war. And so he lives his life at home while the war is happening and, is kind of trying to cope with a personal life that doesn't turn out the way that he wants it to. And I feel like in some ways It's a Wonderful Life is more timeless in the fact that the struggles and stuff are kind of ever present of, what happens when your life keeps getting derailed from your plans and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The Best Years of Our Lives is an equally excellent film, but it does have a lot more to say for a very specific point in history. And it says it so well that I think, if we're talking about awards and stuff, it needed to be recognized at the time. But in terms of its legacy, it has it still has a legacy. It's just a very different type of legacy than It's a Wonderful Life.
I think they both ended up kind of with recognition that they deserved, right? Like,
Yeah.
One ended up becoming a classic because of the very reasons you described, and one ended
Slow
up being
burn,
the best Oscar of that best picture of that year because of its prescience. And we've talked before about how much the Oscars don't really matter, but how we're also all suckered into using them as a barometer.
Yeah.
But yeah, this one's really good. It's just really good. Even in its use of. Oh, let's talk some technique. We've talked about kind of like the setup, but let's talk some technique. Well, before we get to camera stuff, actually, I want to talk about acting because this one's really important, and especially because a lot of the work that I did on this episode and lead up to it was basically as a contrast to last week's episode, which was about Billy Wilder, specifically because we kind of conjoined the two.
Yeah.
And Billy Wilder is super, super stylistic. And William Wyler is, in a lot of ways, kind of the antithesis of that. Like,
Can
he has a very
break
distinct...
that down for me? What you mean by that?
Billy Wilder being stylistic?
Yeah, what do you mean by stylistic in this context?
In this context, it's less like our modern idea of stylism, where there's a lot of very obvious effects and such.
Yeah, because in that sense, I would say Wyler is more stylistic.
But I'm thinking more about the idea of stuff within a movie that calls attention to it being a movie, and is okay with the audience understanding that it's part of a movie to tell it. So when we talk about Billy Wilder, we'd have to talk about stuff like narration and meta elements that call attention to the audience, that as they're watching something, there is a storyteller telling the story, there is a camera, there is someone... this is a made-up world and stuff like that. Whereas with Wyler, stuff is very grand, and he has all of his techniques, which we are going to get into. But at the end of the day, a lot of his techniques don't call attention to the fact that it's a movie, right? It's one of those things, like the idea of stylism being stylistic as a term is kind of like a false term, right? It's because everyone has style, even people who hide the style.
That's their style.
Have style. That just is their style. Stylism is calling attention to the fact that you have a style and being okay with that. Not necessarily to showboat, but that's just how you tell a story. So in Wyler's case, I feel very immersed in the world when I watch a Wyler movie. I normally forget that I'm watching a movie while I'm watching a Wyler movie. And The Best Years of Our Lives might be one of the best examples of that because of how kind of built around everyday life it is, and kind of like this one extraordinary period in time, but how it was essentially everyday life for everybody in that period of time. So it just felt very normal, felt like I was watching just snippets of people's lives over the course of the movie. he doesn't go too fast with the camera, which is weird because his movies feel very nicely paced. But one of the things he's very good at is not cluttering up with dialogue and just letting the performance sit. And he has this reputation, and we're going to have to talk about it because sometimes he gets a little extreme with it. He has a nickname called 40 Take Wyler, and it's exactly what you think it is. And it's just him doing take after take after take after take. And the way he does it ends up with him getting these really good dialogue-free, silent bits of acting, mostly reactions, stuff like the Kuleshov effect, like a character reacting to something in a different cut, or a look between two characters because they've done the scene 30 times and they basically live in that scene now and they are those people.
Did you find any of the anecdotes of actors' point of view?
I saw one or two earlier where it was, I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been like somebody in this movie. Or was it Gary Cooper in Roman Holiday, who was like, yeah, he just kept making me do it over and over. When I asked him what I was doing wrong, he was like, it's trash. It's not good. Like, just do it good. Which isn't great directing, but it got there.
Yeah, so that's similar to I saw this in a couple of different places. I think Charlton Heston talks about it, but basically, like, yeah, that would be his style, is to just ask the actor to do it multiple times, and when they ask for direction, he would just say, just do it again. He wouldn't like tell them what to change. He wouldn't tell them, basically just getting them to do a bunch of the same thing or like just change something. And I think, because my first impression too is that that's like lazy directing, but I think what it ends up doing is making the actor think about it. It makes them think about, okay, well, what can I do differently? What can I, change about my approach to the scene or the actors or whatever. But yeah, it was like he would just give them nothing, and then, but they would, almost all of them that I read said that like he would talk to them after the film comes out, and he would just like in parting say, hey, you did really good in that movie. I just rewatched it. And they're like, what? I don't even know what I did. And Wyler would be like, yeah, I would have them do it so many times that then, in the cutting room, I would like kind of have the right shot or the right performance that I wanted. But then since we'd done the scene so many times, like something was off in the background or something. And then you have to pick, whether or not you're going to use the one that's technically correct or the one where the actor did the better performance. So it's, again, kind of in contrast to Billy Wilder, who we talked about as being like extremely economical. Like, we're going to shoot this shot, and then we're going to shoot this shot, and then we're going to shoot this shot, and we're only shooting what's going to go in. While Wyler is like, we're just going to shoot it as many times until I'm happy with it, and the actor figures it out.
Yeah, sounds like he spent a lot of time in the cutting room for sure to make that work. It's a very interesting, very instinctual kind of directing. And it kind of jives with the fact that he's worked with so many huge, hyper-talented actors.
Yeah, none of them seem resentful of it, surprisingly, because when you hear the same story of Hitchcock or Kubrick, it's always like, oh my gosh, he was a beast and a tyrant to work with. But Wyler, they're like, oh no, he was great. He was just really demanding.
Yeah. I think there's one case that we might have to talk about today where he kind of goes a bit extreme on that.
Yeah.
But even in that case, I don't think there's a lot of resentment attached to the story after the fact.
Right.
Which is interesting, and I don't really have an answer for. But
just a good guy.
But yeah. I don't know. Yeah. He's definitely, I don't know, he's one of the troublemakers. I think he understands people who like to buck systems, which makes him like a weirdly good fit for somebody to be in charge of a set. So I don't know. It's very interesting, but it works, and it kind of leads to the style, a style that coincidentally built off of all of these silent looks and expressions, jives very well with his camera style of deep focus, which. Jonathan, I'm sure you have some examples you want to talk about in this film of deep focus. There's a few very famous ones. Yeah.
Like you already mentioned, the most famous one is the one when Al makes Fred call Peggy and tell her that he can't see her anymore. And super tense scene, and we get this moment where Homer is playing the piano with his hooks, which we're going to get into in a second. And Al is watching them play, and then in the very back of the bar, there is a phone booth. And there's a spotlight on the phone booth, and we see Fred in there. And so the scene plays out with Homer playing the piano in the very front of the frame, Fred behind the piano, or Al behind the piano, and Fred all the way in the back. But you can see all of it. And actually, oh gosh, who is it? There's a whole thing with Andre Bazin, who's one of the actual starters of surrealism. But this idea of deep focus and being able to see everything, he thought of as like a way to kind of progress film into showing reality like more as it is. Because if you're in that situation, you would be able to shift your attention to any of those spots in the frame. Like the real action of the scene is happening in the very back in like a box.
It's completely silent.
It's like 10% of the frame, but that is where your attention is.
Yeah. The whole frame is a tunnel to pointing you at that, but also giving you the other characters' impressions, understandings, and reactions to what's going on.
Yeah. And if you do that, like today, we're so obsessed with shallow focus, which is kind of understandable because it was a thing that only cinema cameras could do for a long time, and now a bunch of consumer cameras can do it. But
we're so obsessed with shallow focus that we have I routinely process shots for work that are just straight up out of focus. And when I mark it, it comes back later as like, nah, we meant that's the style.
Oh, gosh.
Out of focus? Yeah. It's cool,
which
right?
Has a place, but not in everything. So like the way that this would happen is you could probably get Homer and Al in the same focal plane and kind of see that action. Then you rack focus back to the back of the thing and then back. And then it's like the camera is shifting your attention for you. And then that does take you out of the movie. But here, everything is presented at the same time. And you're able to shift your focus around and stuff like that. And the scene plays for a while, too.
It meshes so well with his immersive style already. Where you just kind of feel like you're part of the movie, to just let you essentially just sit in this movie and stare at it and pick essentially your shot or frame. It's kind of like what they've been trying to do with the idea of a VR movie, but like better than anyone could ever do with a VR movie.
Yeah, because there is still limitations. You still have your frame, but within that frame, you have complete freedom.
Yeah, there still is that artistic choice. There still is that curation, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things. I don't know why I'm suddenly on this tangent. It's probably because I've worked on a little bit on a VR movie once and it wasn't good. But the idea of a VR movie is possible. It's just a lot of work because you have to curate every square inch of where the viewer is essentially looking, so that everywhere they look is a good. Yeah, everywhere the viewer is looking is a good choice, which is hard when the view angle isn't, 70 degrees within a bar on a deep focus camera and lens setup. It's 360 degrees. You have to look up at the ceiling and have the ceiling be interesting.
Yeah. Which is impossible because in life, there's not, like, every angle is not the right angle to be looking at to be focused on what you should be.
The filmmakers are doing you a service by cutting out the boring parts. That's literally their job. And one of the things they drill into your head in film school and Film 101 is if it's not interesting, cut it. Get it out of there. Don't waste your time on it. Don't clutter it up. Or
rather, if it's not adding to the story. I wouldn't say if it's not interesting because that's really subjective.
Oh, for sure. But yeah, all that is to say that the curation and work that goes into making a really good deep focus shot is very impressive. And it also happens to jive really well with Wyler's storytelling style to begin with. And his pre-Kubrickian mini takes set up.
All right. Well, while we're talking about this scene with Homer at the piano, we got to talk about Homer because this is our non-actor. This is a real vet. I mean, obviously, a lot of these actors are real veterans of the war, but also a lot of them were actors before, and they come back, and they're classically trained. But for this film, Wyler wanted an actor that had lost both of his hands, and so they find Harold Russell, and he is doing this, and you can tell that he's kind of green in the acting world. And Wyler would even say, speaking of his demanding style, that he would kind of put his kid gloves on with Russell and coach him through it a little bit more, and he would also let the other actors kind of help him out. And he does a great, I think for the first 20-30 minutes of the film, I could really tell that he there's something about him that feels really stiff. But by the end of the film, you just believe it, and you kind of have to, because at some point, I mean, so it's hard to say who the main character of this film is, but all the characters kind of revolve around Homer in a weird way. He's not the most important one, but he's almost the one that guides the story and really keeps everything from falling completely apart. So it's each of the storylines, the one with Fred and Peggy is kind of the dramatic thrust, but they're all really integral to each other. I think even Al's storyline, with his wife, who, of the romantic relationships, they have the most stable of the romantic relationships, because he comes back to his wife, and they take some time to get back to their regular intimacy, but they get there and they don't fall apart. But there's still one line that kind of haunts me about their relationship throughout the thing, and that's when the first night when he comes back and he takes them out to every bar and just gets slammed, and then his wife pretends like she's some random girl at a bar, and he starts going along no, this night is just for us. And you get this sense that she figured out that this is what he was like when he was in the war, and didn't know if he would be coming back. And yet she doesn't let it kind of destroy her trust in him. It's so underplayed. It's a tiny line that is never made a thing out of, but it adds a whole layer of depth to their relationship. Yeah. I think it's really interesting.
It's tiny, but I think it's like we've said before, with this being such a timely movie, I think it works because I think a lot of people in the audience in 1946 would have known exactly what they were talking about.
Oh, yeah.
And it's also echoed in one of the fights that Fred has with his just terrible first wife. Now ex-wife. She's not good. She's, I guess, understandable in a way, but she's also I guess she was brought up in a system that kind of forced her to take some of these ideas, but then she took those ideas to the extreme, and it's just it's real nasty.
It's also understandable on both sides, because you kind of feel well, why would Fred have married her? But again, the underlying assumption on all of this is, I might not come back, so let me marry the prettiest girl that I can find, and then he has to deal with that later.
Yeah, and then they have that fight where he's like, "Oh, I bet you had a lot of visitors here while I was gone," and she was like, "And what were you doing in France and Britain while you were over there?" And it was kind of well,
he doesn't respond to that.
Yeah. It's not a huge thing, but it's just kind of one of those underlying, I guess, understandings of that kind of traumatic situation. But yeah, again, it's very subtle. It's very real. And it would be easy to miss if the film wasn't already so engrossing, because you feel so sympathetic and attached to all these characters. Literally, by the time I think I was attached to all these characters by the time they were getting out of the cab, and each one was like, "Oh, what if we just go do something else first?" And everyone was like, we understand where you're coming from, but you gotta go home."
That is a genius, for lack of a better term, like save the cat moment, where you just like are immediately on their side because you see how afraid they are of trying to get back to normal life, one at a time. Yeah, and I will say, like, another part about this film that's so good and that's so like there's such a layered tapestry of themes in here, and one of them is the idea of communication. Like you said, the silent generation, where they come back and they wouldn't talk about it, and the film like handles that. Like the whole thing with Peggy and Fred is that Peggy is there and listens to him, and his wife just wants to go party and doesn't care about his war thing. Even Al's son, who, well, first of all, that whole scene where he's like bringing
10 seconds.
Yeah, he's not on very long. But that whole scene where Al comes home, it's like, here's a Japanese flag that I pulled off of a dead soldier. Like, okay, thanks, Dad. What am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah, I also totally get the kid being like, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah. But
yeah,
there's this whole thing of Al's family like has such an open communication. He even says that. He's like, it may be old fashioned, but we talk to each other. And the way that like Peggy expresses all of her feelings with her parents and stuff like that.
That was super healthy. That whole scene was like, wow, look at how like kind and loving and supportive this family is.
And then the same thing runs through the Homer storyline, where he is in love with his girlfriend from high school, but
his girlfriend's still in love with him.
Yeah, but he's too scared to open up to her because of his disability now. And so that the scene where he lets her like basically go through his getting ready for bed routine and literally taking off his arms and being completely helpless with her is the thing that rekindles their relationship, because he finally lets her talk to. I know this, like, there's so much built into that.
I think about like the boldness and like not in typical keeping of like that standard idea of like what a man does for the time, but like it's such a glorious scene when this man decides to be totally vulnerable and weak, and that was what he was scared of. I don't think because when she sees it, I think there's two things going through her head. I think she's like, one, oh, this is it? That's all you were scared of? But also, like, she understands that what I think he was really scared of is being vulnerable and weak with somebody. And that's something that everyone has to learn at some point if you want to be in a relationship. And, like, that whole scene is just so sweet and, like, healthy and good. I liked it a lot. I love this movie. It's a good movie. There's a reason I gave it 5 stars on Letterboxd.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to it. That does, in a sense, kind of transcend it. Like these interpersonal relationships are things that happen all the time, and so it does transcend out of its moment. But it's all like couched in this very timely time capsule. But I think all of that should go to and we've done a whole series on World War II films, and we're just like
we're about to do a whole series on the best years of our lives at this rate.
I know, right? But I think that like movies like this are great because they have these timeless human qualities, but they're also still like a warning. Like, we don't want to have to deal with these exact problems again, so let's not do that World War II thing again.
Yeah. Well, 2 thoughts I had while I was watching this movie was, one of the things we didn't focus a lot on in the World War II series was like that aftermath of like people picking up the pieces and like restructuring their life afterwards.
It was mostly
like,
the Nazi aftermath.
Yeah. And the other thing I was thinking is that, yes, this is a very specific movie to like World War II, but also like for other veterans of other wars who come home after war and suddenly find that, while they're overseas, they were heroes, and now when they're back, they're just a nobody vet. Like, there's still some prescience there. Yeah. Well, when you apply to a job, they're like, "What do you know how to do?" "I can bomb things." Can you work a soda counter?
But even at the end, when he finds the other vet, and he's like, I know how to learn stuff, just like I learned how to fly that plane, which I didn't know how to do. And the other vet's like, all right, I get that. I had to do the same thing. And that gets him his job eventually.
Persuasion check with advantage.
All right. Good stuff. Shall we
Let's
move on?
It's been so long. It's nearly an hour into the podcast.
We got 2 movies in Rome, and we're starting with Roman Holiday from 1953. Jason, take it away.
Roman Holiday from 1953. Crown Princess Anne's life is a whirl of appointments, meetings, greetings, formalities, and pleasantries. It is a ruthless, unending, inescapable schedule. Joe Bradley's life is a slog of uninteresting work and scraping by financially at the Rome branch of the American News Service, until one night when Princess Anne decides to take a little vacation, sneaking away. Stumbling upon her, Joe finds himself facing the story of a lifetime and 24 hours to capture Anne's Roman holiday.
All right, Jonathan, we get to talk about your girl again. We get to talk about Audrey Hepburn. She's back.
Yep.
Basically in a role where, again, like we talked about in the bio, William Wyler kind of helped her adjust to being on the big screen. We did like a whole bio on her before in our Hepburn versus Hepburn series, but she kind of has some acting and performance background, but by the time she got to Hollywood, you kind of have to relearn the whole thing again, how to act on the big screen and take care of that. And of course, this isn't in Hollywood. This is in Hollywood on the Tiber, as it was called at the time. But here we are in Rome with Hepburn learning how to be on the big screen. And man, oh man, does she just have it.
Oh, yeah. And there's actually a funny note. Like, Audrey Hepburn, someone did a screening for her, and a bunch of the directors started wanting to work with her because she was so different from the other leading actresses of the time, just in her look and in her manner and stuff like that. And I think we talked about that extensively in our Hepburn versus Hepburn series. But in this case, Gregory Peck actually insisted that Audrey Hepburn's name appear at the front of the title, right under his name. Even though it was like introducing, she was a new actor, but he was like, she's going to be huge. And if her name isn't up there, I'm going to get so much flack for it later on. And he was right.
Yeah. Good call too. Good call. That just makes it that much more of a powerhouse of a movie, having both Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn in it, right?
It's so interesting seeing Gregory Peck in this type of role, because I feel like there were a lot of screwballs that I was thinking of. I think especially It Happened One Night, because the setup of the journalist and the princess is almost exactly the same. It's just not a bus movie. But in It Happened One Night, there was like, the chemistry is a little bit different. And I think it's interesting that Roman Holiday starts with her literally being drugged, and then Gregory Peck has to figure out what to do with that. And there's this thing, again,
it comes back to Clark Gable?
Yes, Clark Gable.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
It Happened One Night. But in this film, there's this dichotomy that we've talked about a little bit in like Shop Around the Corner, but basically at the beginning, Gregory Peck has all the power in the situation, and Audrey Hepburn is literally drugged, and there's like we were talking about in the last film, Wyler is so well suited for directing actors in these really kind of like intimate situations, because here we're seeing Gregory Peck, like, he has a lot of control over this woman that he's never met, and he kind of, he is the upstanding man of the, golden age and all that kind of stuff. But it's just interesting to see how those situations play out, like when he takes her back to his apartment and she keeps wanting to get in the bed and he's like, no, you can't. And he's kind of being the tough guy a little bit, but the way that it plays off it works really well.
Yeah, honestly, like their relationship, again, there's deceit, but there's like deceit on both sides, and neither one's really trying to take advantage of the other until a certain point, and then they don't. So it ends up being honestly quite sweet. And being like just the holiday the princess needed. to get back on track and do her thing again. Um, but yeah, it is interesting, and I feel like that's another one of Wyler's kind of signatures, especially comparing Roman Holiday to like Best Years of Our Lives, is like kind of like that upstanding, like morally with it leading man. Um, and most of the conflicts that they have is like, yeah, I don't know. Should I make like a journalistic story about this woman who I just found out is the princess? Yeah, I'm gonna do it. Maybe I won't. I like her too much. Um, type of stuff. And yeah, I don't know. It's
Again,
it's a
very similar
really,
to It Happened One Night, but one of the differences is that in It Happened One Night, they actually are able to get together, and here it's the ending is so interesting because it it's like this really isolated moment. Like it's this thing that happened, but they can't end up together, but they can still be grateful for having the day that they had or whatever. And so it's like it's not unsatisfying. It's just not your typical like rom-com ending.
nah. It's really. I love the ending scene. I love the satisfaction on Gregory Peck's face as he walks out. Where he's just like, oh, well, I made a friend and I had a good time and I did the right thing. I love the little tells, which Wyler's so good with, like building up these little tiny signals to the audience. Like how everyone's taking pictures of the princess, and then our photographer friend goes up and takes a picture with his lighter.
The inclusion of the photographer character is a genius element of the story.
It's what it needed, right? Because if it was just those two, it could have easily felt, you could have lost the idea. It could have felt too easily like he was really trying to take advantage of her. But with the other guy, it becomes more of a screwball thing. He's always spilling stuff on him to get him to not say the right thing in the right time. And there's always the constant reminder that what they're doing here is trying to be undercover reporters. They're just terrible at it. And kind of mussing around with that as the day and night slowly become less about that and more about the friendship that's building.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, other than that, it's kind of just a romp movie. And I feel like this is the origin of a lot of similar rom-coms that we see even to this day, where it's just like the whole, like, there's kind of a conflict, but mostly it's just like almost a travelogue. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a Roman holiday, both for the people in the movie and the people in the audience.
Yeah, all shot on location.
Like, hey,
I think it says that in the opening titles. Shot on location.
Very, very much so. In fact, one of the reasons that Wyler eventually agreed to direct Ben-Hur was because he was going to get to go back and shoot in Rome again.
Well, that's one reason.
That's one of the reasons he did it. Among many others, they did kind of have to force his hand to direct Ben-Hur, but eventually he did it. But yeah, it essentially, so the other impression I got doing some research here was that in around the late 40s, I think 1949 or so, was when the Paramount decision hit, and studios in America had to start divesting themselves of their theater chains and stuff like that. But they didn't have to do that in Europe. So a lot of studios like Paramount, which I believe is what this film was made for, started spending a lot of money overseas in those markets where they had access to more industries. They could own more industries there, more parts of the movie making process without being threatened with monopoly laws. And they also had access to that post-war boom of American interest that came on the back of the flood of American investment into rebuilding Europe after World War II. So it was kind of like the perfect recipe for doing American movies in Europe and having a fun time doing it, especially for the cast and crew who were essentially on holiday while they made this movie. Right. So yeah, it honestly sounds like a fun movie to work on. I would have loved to have been with that crew for a day or seen what a day in the life of that crew was like. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. And the whole like the princess in disguise setup and stuff. Which I think is interesting because part of Audrey Hepburn's background is that she was like from, if not like a royal family, it was like a really high, upper class European family before the war.
Yeah.
And so it kind of feels like almost her being herself, and that's kind of just the sense that she always radiates, especially like throughout her career. She's just always the very poised,
Very proper.
yeah,
Has a very noble deportment.
but here it's also kind of that not exactly coming of age, but she starts off very much as like, you know, the girl who's cooped up and just wants to see the world, which is almost similar to what we talked about in Sabrina. There's actually one of the opening scenes in both of the movies is a party happening, and she's like on a balcony or on a tree just watching it like from the outside as an outsider and wanting to be part of that world, which is also kind of a Disney-ish type of thing.
I know you just said the line.
So there you go.
But yeah, she definitely has that bear of like royalty to her that kind of makes her work on screen very well, as just that certain something. Like there's some people who just have a certain something on screen and it just works, and she's one of them. And here it is on full display, and Wyler having fun in Rome, capturing it all and doing a travelogue, and it just works really well. Again, in this one, there's a lot of those same like techniques. There's some defocus in effect, especially when it gets to this big scenes with lots of like noble people and these formal displays and everything's in deep focus.
Oh, those regal houses and whatever, so much detail.
Lots of detail. It's again, it's all captured in high definition for the time and deep focus for your viewing pleasure. They're travel slides essentially for you
There's
to see.
There's even that whole
into the
sequence
of
of the photographs that's just literally just like, I mean, that's the whole point of the movie, is to get like good travel photos, and so you get that like slideshow at the end of all the things that they did.
I also I think I empathize even more with Gregory Peck's character now than I did when I first saw this movie. As someone who's lived in a big touristy city for a while before and hated every second of it, like Gregory Peck does, it can be refreshing to have someone else in need of a vacation suddenly show up and kind of give you a different view into your own life. And I think that's a very interesting angle in here too, where Gregory Peck does not like living in Rome. In fact, he's kind of stuck in Rome at the start of this movie. He's out of money. He can't afford to travel back to America. And he talks about going back to New York a few times over the course of the movie. But he definitely is way happier with his life, if no richer, at the end of the movie than he is at the beginning, and it kind of took an outsider's perspective to get him there, which I find very interesting and
even
very satisfying to watch
because
as
he was literally paying for all of her adventures out of his own pocket.
Yes, he did. But again, it's just a really fun movie, and it's really nice to see. Again, like what we talked about before, how Wyler kind of had those years in the 20s and 30s where he was doing basically assignment movies. And we've talked about that with other directors before. The one that pops most immediately into my head, obviously Billy Wyler did it, but when we talked about The Human Condition...
That's 2 or 3.
I don't even know anymore, man. But when we were talking about... what's his name? He did the Human Condition movies.
Kobayashi.
But he also had a very similar set of years where for like a decade he wasn't in charge of what he made. He was just taking assignments from the studio, doing the best he could with it. It's literally like level grinding as a director. Is like, it's not going to be the best assignment in the world, but you're going to learn a lot when you have to do all those different genres. And we see that skill on display not only in the individual styles that these directors develop, but also in seeing them being able to switch between styles, like The Best Years of Our Lives, which is heavy drama, to Roman Holiday, which is much more lighthearted fare, and again, what we're about to see in Ben-Hur, which is a historical, semi-historical epic. You can't. It's a biblical epic. It's not a historical epic because Ben-Hur, the character, is made up.
It's just set in historical context.
Yeah, I love the quote from Wyler, by the way, that it took a Jew to finally make a good Bible movie, and
I know, I'm so fascinated by that.
He was just taking a swipe at Cecil B. DeMille, but I find it so funny. And then again, we're going to see him change styles totally again for The Collector in 1965.
Mm-hmm.
He also has he's got a gobsmack of westerns, including a lot of really good ones.
Musical,
both silent and spoof.
Funny Girl.
Musical Funny Girl. I haven't seen it yet, but The Liberation of L.B. Jones, which was his last movie ever, looks really weird. And just reading the description, it looks kind of controversial too. So I'm very interested to dive into that. Which there won't be any talk of that on the podcast, but if you want to hear more about my thoughts on more Billy Wilder movies, go check out the Filmlings Discord, free to join, and I post short reviews there all the time. Anyway, Jonathan, do you want to move on to Ben-Hur from 1959, or do you have anything else to say about Roman Holiday?
No, I think that's it. Let's get into Ben-Hur.
All right. Jason, take it away.
Ben-Hur from 1956. Prince Judah Ben-Hur is a wealthy Jewish noble and merchant living in Jerusalem under Roman rule. He cares for his mother and sister and treats his slaves as family, giving the loyal man Simonides' daughter, Esther, permission and her freedom to go get married. Judah's childhood friend, Messala, a Roman by birth, returns after military campaigns a changed man, ruthless and ambitious. He turns on Judah after he refuses to sell out Jewish discontents. Messala soon finds an excuse to have Judah arrested as a traitor and his family thrown in jail for life. Judah finds himself on an epic journey from slave to top charioteer to adopted Roman noble, with a benevolent hand guiding him along his path, a path he will follow to vengeance or something much brighter.
Alex, we have not been, the last couple years, we've not been doing holiday-themed ending episodes, but this is a Christmas movie. This is like the ultimate Christmas movie because it starts with Christmas and ends with Easter. So it's perfect.
Yeah, very, very intentionally, which I find fascinating. It's also just like a fascinating idea because, well, this is based off of a book, right? Mm-hmm. That is even longer than the movie.
Yes. Highly recommend the book, by the way.
In fact, isn't there like a whole section at the end where Ben-Hur like fakes his death or something, and goes undercover? Man, that might have been.
It's been a while since I read it.
Yeah, I just remember reading about the development of this movie because it went through a bunch of different scripts, and the guy who eventually wrote the script supposedly cut out that section, or maybe someone else had added in a section at the end where there was supposed to be another act where Ben-Hur, after Jesus's crucifixion, fakes his death and goes undercover and essentially leads a revolt against the Romans and drives them out of Israel. It's wacky. It's wacky, but apparently, like, this is a sprawling epic over like the course of 30 some odd years. Very specifically.
I don't think so, but I do want to bring like that ties into a point that I think is important, especially in kind of the film, because part of the story of the book that is it's kind of underlies in the film. It's not really the focus necessarily, but it's the idea of basically how do you fighting with violence versus fighting with love. I mean, there's a chant at the very beginning that Ben-Hur and Messala do where they go down Eros, up Mars, basically down love, up war. And that's kind of this mentality that over the course of the film, Ben-Hur, who is on this revenge quest, is also at the same time coming into encounters with Jesus and the teachings of, turn the other cheek and stuff, which is all implied, which I think is a really fascinating aspect of the film. But, as long as you understand...
Jesus in a Jesus movie.
I know, but as long as you generally understand, kind of the Christian framework, what he's encountering every time he sees Jesus, and that is the ideas of, and I think Esther actually says it, is the ideas of love your enemies, as opposed to, fighting, which is all he wants to do is get back at Messala, and then eventually get back at Rome. And another part of the whole Christian story is that the Jews were expecting the Christ to come as a warrior king, and he came and died and was completely subverted their expectations. So Ben-Hur is kind of the personification of that and kind of having to shift that mindset. which I think is so interesting. And it's there. It's kind of interesting because the love aspect doesn't come all the way around on Ben-Hur's side, but you get the threads of that theme throughout the film.
Oh, for sure. And that's kind of like the structure of it, right? Like, structure of it is that Ben-Hur's life is running in parallel to the events of Jesus's life, and they also structure the thematic, or dramatic and thematic problems, situations, complications, and problem solving of Ben-Hur in parallel to Jesus' teachings at different points in time. And there's like 4 or 5 times where we actually see like a fragment of the man himself on screen. But
Which is one of the deep focus shots I want to
intentionally-
bring up.
Yes, but very intentionally, he's never like a full-faced character in this story, because it's not the story of the Passion of the Christ or something like that. It's about Ben-Hur. It's in a way, it's trying to apply those teachings to one man's life in the most direct way possible.
Yeah.
Which
like
is,
you said,
which
those
is a very
parallels
interesting take on it.
are the parallels of the peacemaker and the parallels of the war maker. Because even Pontius Pilate, after he wins the chariot race, calls Ben-Hur the god of the Jewish people. And that's, again, in contrast to Jesus, who also the king of the Jewish people, but in the peaceful aspect, not in the champion aspect. So there's so much, like the aspect of this film that kind of parallels with something like Gladiator, I think is also fascinating, because
Gladiator
is all about the championship, and the war and the revenge. But this film has so many of those same threads, but also with the peace contrast underlying it.
Yeah. I was thinking while I was watching this that Gladiator is kind of like Ben-Hur, but you just, I don't know, took the religious aspect out of it entirely.
Right.
In
Also
a lot of
kind
ways.
of similar to Braveheart.
Yeah. And all of those, of course, fall under like the vengeance idea and the idea of revenge, which we talked about. I think we did a whole series on vengeance before.
We did, yeah.
And the conclusion was essentially that while satisfying and potentially deserved, it often hurts like the person seeking it more than it hurts the person you're seeking revenge on.
Yeah.
And it's even when you accomplish it, it's like normally a fruitless endeavor. Doesn't actually benefit you in any way. So it's interesting to watch this movie with that in its in idea in your head already. But all that said, of course, it's also interesting to see Wyler's techniques applied to such a big movie with
Every
big
sense of the
sets
word.
to all keep in deep focus, which can lead to like these really detailed, really big scenes of this Roman world, which are really interesting to see and examine. Whether it be the villa in Rome or Masala's palace in Judea, or the galley, which is also really cool and super detailed. And they shot that whole sea battle as well. Well, they shot a model of the sea battle. And then there was like one on deck fight scene that was probably in a water tank on the Paramount lot.
Yeah. But you still get the scale of the thing. And I do think it's so interesting that apparently Wyler was not a fan of widescreen, did not want to use the format.
Yeah, that's right. This is all CinemaScope.
Oh yeah, it's like widescreen. It's like the example of widescreen. But his thought process was that if you could see everything, then there's no like focus. But he was able to still use that, and him and the cinematographer used a bunch of tested a bunch of lenses and techniques and stuff, and so they do get those really deep shots and stuff. And there's one that I love when Ben-Hur is kind of he encounters Jesus doing the Sermon on the Mount, but he decides to not listen to him, and he kind of goes and walks off in search of Masala. And we see this huge shot of Jesus right in the middle at the front on the hill, all the people down the hill listening, and Ben-Hur is walking in the very back, and you can see Jesus' head turn and follow Ben-Hur as he walks across the frame. And it's so subtle, but that is what that deep focus is for. It's to keep all of that perspective in the shot.
Yeah, no, you can do a lot with the idea of deep focus and kind of like layering these shots, which just makes an already sprawling movie that much deeper and that much more interesting. And again, much like with The Best Years of Our Lives, it doesn't really feel that long, which is weird to say because it is so freaking long, but it doesn't take that long to pass. Even when it's not focused on action, everything feels very pointed. The setup is very clear. The goals are clear.
The chariot race is like 3/4 of the way through.
The chariot race, which is probably the most famous part of the movie, is really late. It's really late. And I know you were saying, Jonathan, that it wasn't actually shot by Wyler. It was all second unit, which is pretty common for a lot of heavy action stuff. But it was done by a second unit.
Yeah, I think the only shot that Wyler actually did was the one from above the statue while all the horses are parading around, which is actually its own thing because the film, like, they did a lot to focus on historical accuracy of Rome and the sets and all that kind of stuff. But he caught some flack because the whole like walking the chariots around the stadium was not something that would have been done. But he didn't want to like waste the scene because most of the chariot race happens in medium and close-up shots, which is, first of all, fascinating because Heston and the other actor are doing all of those like charioteering. They did most of those stunts, which is, oh my gosh, terrifying. Heston was already like, he's familiar with horses already, but still, like, the intensity of that scene is hard to fake. But anyway, yeah, the whole scene was shot by a second unit, and actually I just learned that Sergio Leone was one of the assistants to the second unit director, which makes sense because he was working in Italy.
It also explains a lot, having researched all of the Hollywood investment into like Italian studios at the time, how Sergio Leone and other Italian filmmakers of his cohort kind of started to get a lot of their feet wet and learn a lot, cut their teeth with a lot of like this American talent that's already been going for decades over in Italy.
And also, I just learned this because I always believed this, but apparently, stuntman did not die while filming the scene. I totally thought that was true, and apparently it's not. But there are some terrifying accidents that happened. There was actually an accident with one of the second unit director's son, who was a stuntman, where he was actually like thrown over the edge of the little chariot cart thing. I think it has a technical name, but I don't know it. And they wanted to use the shot in wide, and so they shot a pickup of a close-up of Charlton Heston being thrown to the front of his chariot and having to climb his way back in, which is now a very like famous and kind of pivotal part of that scene.
Adds a lot of tension. It's a good little segment.
And aside from the actual excitement of the chariot race, because it's so like the shots like really immerse you in what's actually happening. But I think what's interesting is that when we're talking about it as a revenge story, it actually takes a lot of the guilt or responsibility off of our main character for the ultimate revenge that he gets, you know? Like it's not really like his fault. It's not like Taken, he tracked him down and just straight up murdered him. But it was
Masala's own ambition that killed.
Yeah, it was in the course of the game, and Masala was the one not playing fair, and Ben-Hur wins, and Masala is his chariot's destroyed and he's trampled and stuff, and then his own hubris doesn't let him get the attention that he needs. So it's interesting that the revenge is satisfied, but not in a way that takes away from Ben-Hur's character. It's not a noir in an anti-hero type of a way.
No, that yeah. It was just ashes in the mouth. It wasn't anything satisfying.
Yeah.
No, it's a fitting into that arc. Actually, it makes a lot of sense with the themes of the story, and it's a good message to send home at the end of the day that vengeance isn't really a satisfying experience for anybody. So
Yeah. And
yeah,
even
yeah.
even the character says at that point, when Masala's like, "There's enough of a man here left to hate," and Ben-Hur says, "I don't see an enemy." So it's still not. There's still, again, like, Ben-Hur gets it at that point.
Yeah.
So another kind of random fun fact, but when looking this up, I saw some of the actors that were considered for Ben-Hur, and it's a pretty interesting list. So Burt Lancaster was considered, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Rock Hudson, Kirk Douglas, all make sense, and Leslie Nielsen, who was early in his career, and like probably his career would have been very different if he had ended up in this role.
I'm trying to remember who that is. Let me do.
He's the guy from Airplane,
Oh yeah, that's way different.
isn't it?
Yeah, that would have been way different.
I think he had done he was a character actor at that point, and I think he had just done like a Western and something, and so he was kind of just like a young strapping guy. But now that's like not what we think of when we think of Leslie Nielsen.
Oh, for sure. Don't call him Shirley. Anyway, do you wanna move on to The Collector from 1965?
Let's do it. Jason, lock us in a basement.
Jason, please don't lock us in a basement.
Set it up for us, though.
The Collector from 1965. Freddie, a socially awkward man with a farmhouse at his disposal, turns out to be a bit of a sociopath and stalks, then kidnaps Miranda, a girl he obsesses over. Not wanting to ransom her or turn her into a sex slave, Freddie reveals that he loves Miranda and intends to hold her captive until she loves him back. A psychological cat and mouse game ensues, one that pits Miranda's desperation against Freddie's twisted mind.
All right, Jonathan. This one is kind of the curveball one from the lineup for this episode. It is
Very
super
much so.
different. It's way tighter. It's under 2 hours. It only features 2 characters.
And like,
And even
2
Roman Holiday.
sets.
Yeah, even Roman Holiday featured like maybe a dozen or so characters. And yeah, it's small, it's tight, it's tense, it's a thriller, which is different. It was definitely not considered mainstream fare at the time. So it's interesting to see a big mainstream director veer towards genre filmmaking when that wasn't necessarily part of their over at the time.
Yeah, and I'm so kind of confused about this movie. I didn't find much about, like, I think this is one where directors just have like a bunch of, projects that they accept and they do them, and some of them they talk about more than others. There's not a ton of information about this movie, but it's so interesting coming from the guy who did Ben-Hur, and then suddenly he does a movie. I mean, not suddenly, it's not like right after, but then he does this movie that takes place with 2 characters in a basement in a old like English cottage house, and it feels like it was him trying to do Psycho. That's the only thing I can think of, but it's really not
the guy
Psycho.
from Psycho was considered for this role.
Yeah. Anthony Perkins.
One thing that will make this feel a little bit more part of William Wyler's canon is the fact that one of the first cuts he finished was like 3 hours long. There's like an hour-long prologue featuring like an entirely different character too. That was just completely cut from the movie, which honestly makes sense for a thriller. But yeah, it's an interesting contrast between somebody who's known for dramatic epics to be moving to a small, tight thriller. But it also, like, again, you can see his experience with a bunch of different genres and Westerns, which are basically genre picks. They've been much more mainstream for a large chunk of film history, but they're also genre picks after a sort. To see, it makes sense to see him take the skills he picked up from there and turn it to this. This is also the one where he kind of went full Kubrick.
Yeah, let's just get into that.
The actress, I can't remember her first name, but her last name is Egger, where essentially, there was a point where she was fired, then she was brought back if she agreed to work with an acting coach, but the only person she was allowed to speak to outside of a scene was the acting coach. She wasn't allowed to speak to any of the cast or the crew or the director. Outside of that, just the acting coach. And he would just make her do... He made a point of not speaking to her, even from the get-go. He wanted to make her essentially feel isolated and paranoid and stressed, like the character would in the movie, which, again, we're creeping into that Kubrick territory.
Yeah.
I think nowadays you wouldn't see that happen, just for obvious reasons.
I think there's enough of a stigma against being Kubrick-esque that no one wants to get close to that.
Abusing your actors for art isn't cool.
Yeah.
And definitely, like, what he did was, like, I don't know if I would call it, like, full-on abuse, maybe, like, psychological abuse, definitely, like, a workplace violation, like an HR violation, for sure. But it was not cool. And
Can I just throw out that apparently
performance.
One of the reasons that he picked this pair is because somehow he knew that Terrence Stamp had a crush on Samantha Eggar when they were both in the same acting school.
Yes,
and that's
actually,
just like
I did find
next
that out.
level weird.
That's like up in your business. That is kind of creepy.
And then to make you make this movie, oh man. And the other thing is, and maybe this is just like a more modern thing, but the whole script feels very much like, oh gosh, I hate to say it, but it feels like something that you come up with in college when you're still trying to figure out what makes a good story. And you're like, this sounds exciting. It's like a creepy guy and he kidnaps a girl to try and make her fall in love with him. And he's just like so psychotic that he can't get it through his head. And that's kind of what it is, but it's still like coming from a director who knows fully what he's doing.
Yes.
And in that sense, like the scenes work, but the setup is just still mind-boggling to me.
Yes, for sure. It's probably too far. Like, he didn't need to go this far for this movie, I don't think. I think he was
not
kind
for
of like
this movie.
he was kind of
Like,
like
the
playing
movie's
three-dimensional. He's like playing three-dimensional chess with himself. It's not. It's I wouldn't call it the most satisfying serial killer movie ever.
It's not technically a serial killer movie either.
It kind of is. Like, there's a hint that he's done it before at the very beginning. There is.
I don't think so. I think there's a hint that he hasn't done it before. What are you thinking?
I think at the beginning there's like a point where he's like, I decided to do it again, or something like that. But there's definitely a hint at the end, like kind of a twist at the end.
Yeah. At the end,
he's
which I was totally expecting. But at the beginning, what he says is he bought the house, but even then I didn't think I would do it. I was just thinking about it. So it's like he surprised himself by actually going through with it. So that's why I think this was like the first one. And especially because this is like the whole point is that this is like his first crush and stuff like that. But anyway, either way, it's kind of implied by the end that he is like so demented that he is just going to keep trying this until he gets what he wants.
Yeah. This character is completely broken. There is nothing that Samantha Eggar's character could have done to get out of the situation, as kind of like one of the twists towards the end when you realize that, he will take everything negatively. There is no answer here.
Yeah.
He at the very end, she's just giving him everything he wants, and he's like, no, I don't want it, and then kills her.
Unless it's real, but he doesn't realize that it can't be real under the situation that he's created, which I think is like the psychological game of chess is kind of interesting. And it is something that I think kind of elevates it, because it's not a straight, like, it's not Saw, right? It's not a slasher. But it's this slow burn thing of just seeing this broken guy trying to figure out what he wants and not being able to come to terms with it.
Oh yeah. He's a little more than broken. He is psychotically unstable, if not a full-on like sociopath or psychopath or something like that.
It's very much
He's,
like a again, it's a Norman Bates, but without the full on murderiness. Because it's not technically murder by the end, right?
yeah. Wait, what? Do you say it wasn't technically murder?
Yeah, it's not technically murder.
How so?
Well, how was it? Okay, so he kidnaps her. Okay, we're in spoiler territory, by the way.
Yeah.
So he kidnaps her, but she dies like more or less by accident, right? Because he locks her back up. She trips over the heater, and then she smashed him in the head, so he goes to the hospital. By the time he gets back, she has pneumonia or something and is about to die, and then he goes to get the doctor. And by the time he comes, so he decides to not get the doctor, which might be the main like intentional part of it, but still she dies because of the heater being broken and him not being there, right?
Yeah, yeah, she does, kind of like a butterfly in a bell jar. But yeah, at that point he's done so much that like it's at least second degree murder, if not first degree murder. Like it might as well be at that point. Like,
Yeah. Although it seems like, I mean, this dude's messed up, but it doesn't seem like murder was part of the plan. It was just
No.
keep her alive until she loves him, which would have been
Nah.
indefinite, but
yeah.
and then, it could, afterwards we could speculate it could have been, arsenic and old lace thing where he realizes that she was happier when she was dead. And so the next girl he takes, he kills her too. But the whole basement set also just makes me think it's so like Corman-esque because of the weird like colored lighting in that little basement. And I feel like we just have to put this in context, right? So this is 5 years after Psycho. This is in the middle of the time that Roger Corman is making his low budget, like creepy thriller Edgar Allan Poe movies and Little Shop of Horrors. Night of the Living Dead doesn't come out till 3 years later, but this still fits somewhere on that trajectory of the low budget thriller craze, right? Because that's like its own thread of cinema.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was basically like the period of time where kind of like creepy, what our more modern idea of horror started to creep out there, and serial killers, and we started to become more and more obsessed with like psychopaths and stuff like that started to emerge. So it's kind of part of that as well. And it's interesting to see essentially like the previous era, because this is right at the tail end of Wyler's career, a director from the previous era kind of trying to take on that concept of the new era, and see his take on it. And it's not bad. It's not ultimately satisfying. It doesn't feel like it falls into like the classic category of that genre. Maybe as like an interesting early or attempt at it. And I'm sure that if Wyler had taken one or two more cracks at the genre, then he would have made something pretty dang good. But like it's something totally out of his wheelhouse, and just kudos for even trying that in the first place. Like,
yeah, it's just like the choice of it is the oddest thing, I think. But he takes it and he runs with it.
Yep. All right. Anything else to mention about The Collector before we move on to overall notes?
Oh, not much, except that it inspired an actual serial killer. That's all.
Oh yeah. I haven't heard about this, so tell me more.
So in the mid 80s, I'm not even gonna say the guy's name, but there was a serial killer known as the Kansas City Butcher, or the Collector. Killed 6 men and tortured them in a basement or something. And he cited this film as one of his inspirations for acting on his sick psychopathic fantasies. So there's that. That's why he was called the Collector, obviously.
Yeah, geez, that's not a great legacy.
No,
but it is
not great.
Intriguing, I guess.
And also, like, there was like we said, there was no like torture or intended murder in the film. So I don't know how much you can like chalk up to it, but that's what he said. He's dead now.
Oh, for sure. Anyway, let's slide into overall notes and talk about Wyler as a whole. We've already talked about how he's kind of more immersive and calls less attention to his style than someone like Billy Wilder. but he does have a very distinct style with his deep focus shots, and his focus on performance and doing 5 billion takes until stuff feels very natural. And you get these really good and unique performances, award-winning performances, and how he makes you just feel like part of the world. And so intrigued and interested that these 3-4 hour epics just go by in what feels like a matter of minutes.
Yeah, it's really weird actually, because like there, Ben-Hur is exciting, but also has a lot of like scenes of talking and kind of pulling out the themes. The best years of our lives is not exactly like, again, an exciting film, but like you say, the stories are so tight, like everything feels like it has to be in there, that by the time it's over, you're like, oh yeah, that was a whole 3 hours. It feels like only 3 hours.
Yeah. No, it's quite impressive. Anytime that a movie, one of the biggest compliments you can say about a movie is that you didn't look at the runtime.
Yeah.
You didn't look at, you're not watching the clock to see when it'll be over. It just goes by and you're engrossed in it.
You're only timing it by how many bathroom breaks you have to take.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think the other thing that we've seen kind of throughout his films is this ability to get really intimate performances out of his actors in these really kind of sensitive scenes. Even in The Collector, I think that was that's an important part of The Collector, is that he wants to build this intimate relationship with the girl. He just doesn't know how to do it, and she's trying to figure out like what her position is on all this, because she's not going to fall in love with him.
Well, step one, don't kidnap them.
Right. Which is, it's so interesting, because that's like, it's the one thing that will prevent him from getting what he wants, but it's the only thing he's not going to give up for it. You know, but that creates this really interesting dynamic that is inherently intimate, but also like extremely tense. And that's also a thing with The Best Years of Our Lives. There's a lot of tension in those relationships, the romantic ones and the just normal friendships. And again, Roman Holiday too. There's a lot of like, but they all feel very natural, and they never feel, well, okay, except for The Collector, but they never feel like weird or creepy in ways that they're not supposed to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I just love the stories. I could watch a lot of these films on repeat. They are very good, and a lot of them are instant classics, and probably deserve to be watched and rewatched, especially by people who are looking to become filmmakers or working that kind of space. Like, they are worthy of your attention. So, do recommend.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Jonathan, what are we talking about next season on the podcast?
Yes, this is the end of the year, the end of the season. We are coming back in 2022, and we're going to start off with some fun stuff. We're going to talk about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, who, if you're unaware, were a duo, not officially, but they acted in a lot of films together, and they were prolific as both actors and dancers. And they just charmed the screen for a long time. And so we're going to talk about 3 films starring them. The Gay Divorcee from 1934, Shall We Dance from 1937, and The Barkleys of Broadway from 1949. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Way to kick off the next year, the next season.
Yeah, should be some nice enjoyable holiday fare in case you want to catch up with any of these over the holidays with family, and then be in touch with them for next year's first episode, which should be super cool. What are we talking about on the bonus pod lately, Jonathan?
Yeah, we do have some extra content. If you would like to get that over on our Patreon, you can join our digital community, where we talk about films off the air with the listeners and stuff like that. And we also have a bonus podcast. And the last film that we talked about was a short film called The Duel at Blood Creek, which was a lot of fun. And we somehow sort of related it to LARPing. And as Alex mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about The Memphis Belle and continuing our William Wyler discussion on the upcoming episode. So go check that out on the Discord. Not on the Discord, on the Patreon and the Discord. Check out everything.
And the Discord. Check out the Discord.
The Discord is actually going to be very important because next season we want to start incorporating the voices of our listeners. We're going to start doing a little bit of extra content that relates to listener feedback and questions, and just kind of recapping some of the content and discussions that happen on the Discord. So if you want to be part of that, go check it out. Anyone can join.
Yeah, go check it out. Read our short reviews. Watch movies. Make me watch different movies. It'll be fun.
See what Alex
All right,
thinks
Jonathan.
about every Airbuds movie.
We've already done that. And the Buddies movies, which I think I just did as a group because I don't think I had it in me to do them individually. But yes. Anyway, that is all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 406 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at thefilmlings.
Summaries for each of the films this episode were recorded by me, Jason Harden. You can find me on Twitter at TheBlueJay1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Before they are trained.
Real quick, I looked it up. There is a Guinness Book of Records entry for the movie scene with the most retakes for a single scene, and it was in The Shining with Shelley Duvall.
Gosh.
And it was 127 takes.
Yeah, I think I've heard that number before.
Yep.
Oh boy.